Psychological observation discovers no law for the relation of self-consciousness to actuality, or to the world over against it. And, through the mutual indifference of both, it is forced to fall back on the peculiar determinateness of real individuality, which exists in and for itself, or contains the antithesis of being for itself and being in itself, effaced within its own absolute mediation. Individuality has now become the object for observation, or the object to which observation now turns. With paragraph 309, we now enter a new section of the phenomenology. It's a section within a section within a section. We could talk about all sorts of subsections. We're looking at reason with a sort of capital R, and we're in the subsection observing reason, and now we're in the third part of that, observation of self-consciousness in its immediate actuality, in its Wirklichkeit. And Hegel appends to this the names of two disciplines, physiognomy and phrenology. Now these are two, as we call them today, and as they were actually calling them back then as well, pseudosciences. These are disciplines that present themselves as giving us something that's based in observation of reality, and which is supposed to tell us about the phenomenon, in this case the body, right? That reveals to us the truth, the intelligibility of the phenomenon. But in reality, it turns out that these are just fortuitously connected, and in a way, pseudosciences are worse than no scientific pretensions at all, because they stand in the way of genuine scientific progress. Certainly scientific, not only in the sense that we use it today with our conception of the scientific attitude and scientific method and the massive research projects that we have going on and the influx of technology, but also in the sense of Wissenschaft, the way that Hegel conceives of it, where the human subject understands its own position, its own involvement in the scientific enterprise itself. So, what's happening here in this very short section, where we're not going to get anywhere near physiognomy right at the start, we're picking up where the last one left off. We tried to derive general laws that would allow us to understand the relationship between individuals, or the individual as sort of a category, and then larger scope things, these laws that were supposed to be logical laws or psychological laws. And it turned out that there were all sorts of problems that arose, and they arose precisely because of the type of matter that we were trying to study, that is, individuals. Now, we can study individuals within societies or cultures, but there's always a lot of variance, and it's not just random variance, it's, you might say, intentional variance. Hegel talked in the previous sections about the person who's supposed to be governed by these laws or these conditions or determined in this way, having something almost like a choice, or at the very least a say, let's call it, in whether they would allow those things apply to them, and to what degree, and in what ways, and they reinterpret them. So it's not a pure passivity that we would, perhaps like to have, and that we imagine or we project onto humankind. Rather, humankind takes into account the effects that the determination is supposed to have on it. Now here, we're seeing the aftermath of that. And Hegel talks about psychological observation. Psychological observation was aiming to find some sort of law or laws that would govern the relationship between self-consciousness on the one side and actuality, Wirklichkeit, what we're confronted with, or if you like, the world. And he describes this, he says Here we go. The world over against it, right? The world that's supposed to be determining it. And what happened is, found out we didn't get these laws. Why not? Because these exist in a relation, as he says, of mutual indifference towards each other. So, what does observation do? It tries to go further to grapple with the part that was so recalcitrant to formation of laws, real individuality. And Hegel uses real here as the adjective. So he says, why? It's falling back on the peculiar determinateness of real individuality, which exists in and for itself, right? This is what it is to be a living human being, to exist in and for yourself. Also for others. Also, your in itself is a way of being for others, and we can talk about that in a bit. And he says, it contains the antithesis of being for itself and being in itself if faced within its own absolute mediation. So there's this activity that's going on within any real individuality, within any individual that you might run into on the street, on the bus, interacting with through the internet. Probably doesn't matter so much about what particular medium that we're talking about here. And he goes on and he says, individuality has now become the object for observation, or, and this is a very important turning point, the object to which observation now turns. So what we're going to be looking at through the rest of this long section is how, and we're going to try a number of different hows, and that should lead us to the question whether we can actually find something like law-like regularities that we can then apply to individuals. And we're going to be looking, here's giving away a bit of it, we're going to be looking at the physicality, the corporeality, the bodiliness of the individual. Why are we going to do that? Well, that's really the thing that we get to encounter. Now you're not seeing me bodily by my standing in front of you, or hearing the sound waves themselves going through the air that my whole vocal apparatus is producing. Hegel's also going to talk a lot about hands, right? You notice I do a lot of gesturing. But this is what you get to see. This is what you're presented with when it comes to other people. You can't directly open up somebody's head and suddenly see their soul, or their Geist, their spirit, their mind. So the question that we're going to be faced with is, well, what is the meaning of the body, and how is it related to the soul or the mind or the spirit, whatever it is that you want to talk about, in the individual? Is there any sort of system or discipline or some sort of knack that can open things up for us and make things clear? Or do those turn out to be inherently problematic and just sort of way stations along the path that we're going to traverse? The individual exists in and for himself. He is for himself, or is a free activity. But he has also an intrinsic being, or has an original determinate being of his own, a determinateness which is in principle the same as what psychology thought to find outside of him. In his own self, therefore, there emerges the antithesis, this duality of being the movement of consciousness and the fixed being of an appearing actuality, an actuality which in the individual is immediately his own. This being, the body of the specific individuality, is the latter's original aspect. That aspect in the making of which it is not itself played a part, but since the individual is at the same time only what he has done, his body is also the expression of himself which he has himself produced. It is at the same time a sign which has not remained an immediate fact, but something through which the individual only makes known what he really is when he sets his original nature to work. Here in paragraph 310, we're beginning to study in a reflective and in a phenomenological way, seeing whether that can yield us a scientific, a wissenschaftliche way of understanding the nature of the individual. And that is really going to mean understanding the nature of the individual as body, as Leib in German, as opposed to another word for body, Körper, which could have been used, but this has, the connotation of being the lived body, the body that works, that still is a functioning being, not just meat on a slab. And Hegel is going to draw a number of well, it's not a number of antitheses because it's really the same things that are being opposed to each other in this Gegensatz, this antithesis as Miller is translating it. But there's two sides here. So he says the individual exists in and for himself. Now notice that this in and for himself is getting split into two sides. A pretty familiar move by this point for those who followed Hegel up to this point, isn't it? And he says he is for himself, right? There's the for itself side. And then there's the in itself, which Miller has translated here as intrinsic being. The German is just an sich, so in itself is fine when you compare it with the für sich, the for itself. And let's actually go a little bit out of order here, just to mix it up a bit. So he talks about the side of the in itself, and he says that the individual has what he calls an original determinate being of its own. What does that mean? Well, he says a determinateness, which is in principle the same as what psychology thought to find outside of him. So this determinate being of its own is not being found outside of it. Where is it being found? You might say within its skin, within the boundaries of the body, right? So your body is not something that you have absolute control over, and I don't mean just in the sense of, can you raise your arm or not raise your arm? Okay, you can raise your arm. Now will yourself to stop breathing for 5 minutes. You can't do that. Hegel's not just concerned about the present. He's concerned about, well, where did this body that you've got come from? Why is it the way that it is? And in many respects, we can say that we are responsible at the very least, or even to be praised or blamed for the condition of our bodies. I should lose some weight, right? That presumes that I actually have a choice about losing weight, and that things that I do could, positively or negatively affect my progress towards that goal that either I embrace or that I grudgingly, go for. The doctor tells me you need to lose weight. If I want to exercise, right, I can make my body into a certain type. A good example of this, you wouldn't guess it necessarily by looking at me right now, but in my teens and 20s, I was actually very athletic, and I engaged in a lot of what was called endurance lifting at the time, which was using weights and doing very long routines with many sets, many repetitions, medium amount of weight rather than trying to max out anything. And what was good about that is it left me a frame that I could rely upon for quite some time. That's something I did to my body, right? And we could talk about all sorts of other things as well, damaged parts of my limbs while I was in the army and didn't get it taken care of. Just all sorts of other things, whether we allow ourselves to get enough sleep or not, or whether we're looking at screens late at night. Those things affect our body. They make our body to some degree what it is. But there's a lot of things that we don't actually have control over, and they don't fall within the scope of our activity. There's something that is given to us, right? I was going to end up being tall whether I chose to or not. And I could certainly do things that, as we say, would stunt your growth, and I could affect my posture so I hunch down or something like that, as opposed to standing up straight. But I was not going to be a short person. Likewise, I can dye my hair if I like to, but this is the hair color that I've got. Now it's changed a little bit because there's some white and some gray in it, a lot more in my beard. But you get what you've got, right? You can put contact lenses in, change green eyes to brown or to purple or black if you want, whatever you like. But so far as we're talking about the original inheritance of the body, we've got something that is an original, ursprünglich, determinate being of our own. And he talks about this as the fixed being of appearing actuality. That's a very nice phrase, right? The body does appear. It comes on the scene. And it is an actuality. It is a Wirklichkeit. It is something that we are confronted with. Get up in the morning and you find you're in your body. It's not as if you got out of it during the night and walked around, the way that people do in cartoons. You are your body, and this is a lesson that as you get older, gets driven home to you, more and more, because you may not be entirely happy with the course that your body is taking. Now, on the other side, we have the for itself, what he calls the free activity, the tun, right, the doing. And this he talks about in terms of a movement of consciousness. Now, this is also part of what it is to be a living being, to have a body, to exist in time and space, with other beings like us in the world, all these sorts of things that we can talk about. We have agency. I'm shooting this video right now. Great example. If I smoke, that's up to me. If I don't smoke, that's also up to me. Now, maybe I come from a culture of smokers, or maybe I have genes that predispose me to take more pleasure in that than other people. Those are all things that would be situational. And these two things are in an interplay. Hegel talks about them as being in a Gegensatz, an antithesis, but we should really see this as an opposition that is dynamic. These things interact with each other. He goes on and he says, so this being, the body of the specific individuality, is the latter's original aspect, that aspect in the making of which it is not played a part. Like I said, you get the body you got, and it grows in the ways that it does, and your environment affects it. And some of us, lucked out in certain ways, and some of us got the short end of the stick in other ways. But there's a lot of things that we don't have control over when it comes to our body. It's part of why the Stoics would say body is something you don't actually have within your power. But he says, since the individual is at the same time only what he has done, his body is also the expression of himself, which he has himself produced. Our bodies are, at least to a certain extent, the product of our doing, the product of our choices, the product of our habits, our commitments. So he goes on and he says, it is at the same time a sign which has not remained an immediate fact, but something through which the individual only makes known what he really is when he sets his original nature to work. So the individual gets an original nature and then sets it to work, does something with it, enacts things. And this goes back and forth throughout the course of a life. I should point out one thing here, which is that when Hegel uses the term sign, in general, Hegel views signs as conventional, as not really showing us what the thing itself is, but as something sort of standing in the place of or in the way of the thing that we want to understand. All that said, what we've got here is the body as the locus for all of this. The body is that through which we come to grasp the individual, including the individual that we are. If we consider the moments here before us in relation to the previous view, we have here a general human shape, or at least the general character of a climate, a continent, a people. Just as previously we had the same general customs and culture. In addition, there are the particular circumstances and situation within the general sphere of actuality. Here, this particular actuality is present as a particular formation of the shape of the individual. On the other side, just as previously the free activity of the individual was made explicit, as also the fact of his own actuality in the face of the actuality already given, here the shape stands for the expression of his own actualization established by the individual himself, the lineaments and forms of his spontaneously active being. But the actuality, both general and particular, which observation previously found given outside of the individual, is here the actuality of the individual, his inherited body, and it is precisely in this that the expression originating from his activity appears. From the psychological point of view, actuality in and for itself and the specific individuality were supposed to be brought into relation to one another. Here, however, the whole specific individuality is the object of observation, and each side of the antithesis is itself the whole. To the outer whole, therefore, belongs not only the original being, the inherited body, but equally the formation of the body resulting from the activity of the inner being. The body is the unity of the unshaped and of the shaped being, and is the individual's actuality permeated by his being for self. This whole, which contains within it the specific original fixed parts and the lineaments arising solely from the activity, is, and this being is the expression of the inner being of the individual posited as consciousness and movement. This inner being is, too, no longer a formal spontaneous activity devoid of content, or indeterminate, an activity whose content and determinateness, as before was the case, lay in external circumstances. On the contrary, it is an intrinsically determined original character whose form is merely the activity. We have then to consider here how to determine the relation between these two sides and what is to be understood by this expression of the inner in the outer. Paragraph 311 is fairly long, and there's quite a number of things mentioned in it, but the main features of that, I think, are what I've got here on the board, really in the second half of the paragraph. So let's see where Hegel starts. He begins with a comparison. He says, if we consider the moments here before us in relation to the previous view, that is the view in the previous section, we have here a general human shape, or at least the general character of a climate, a continent, a people, just as previously we had the same general customs and culture, the externalities, the circumstances that were supposed to be determining the individual human being according to psychological laws that were going to more or less make them all behave the same way in similar circumstances, right? And we saw that that wasn't the case. So he says, in addition, there's particular circumstances and situations within the general sphere of actuality. Okay, so what might that be? Well, I happen to be a professor or a speaker or a cabinet maker. I'm born in a certain family. We can go on and on, right? So he says, here, this particular actuality is present as a particular formation of the shape of the individual. On the other side, just as the free activity of the individual is made explicit and the fact of his own actuality in the face of the actuality already given, here's the important transition. Here the shape stands for the expression of his own actualization established by the individual himself through his own activity. So if we want to think in terms of the previous section, what the previous section talked about was the freedom from being determined, the freedom of choosing how it would be determined, that kind of undid any strong sense of determination on the part of the individual in relation to the universal. Here, we're talking less about that, less about the freedom aspect, and more about how the individual himself or herself is, in fact, determining him or herself by their reactions, by their choices, by their own doings. So he goes on and he says, here the shape stands for the expression of his own actualization established by the individual himself, the lineaments and forms of his spontaneously active being. Sounds very dynamic at this point. Then he says, but the actuality, which observation previously found given outside of the individual in the circumstances, right, in what was external to it, it now finds it here in the actuality of the individual, his inherited body. The body that he gets, the body that, by the way, is never really, the same thing from moment to moment to moment to moment, right? Because you could say you inherited your body. When did you inherit it? When you were a little baby, right? Or even before that, in the womb. But you're not that anymore, right? Your cells have changed. You are now probably, if you're watching this, a grown person, unless you're some, very precocious kid. And even then, give it another 10 years, you'll have an adult body. So he goes on and he says, it's precisely in this that the expression originating from his activity appears. So we're looking for, again, a relationship that we've seen before, right? A law of the inner somehow expressing itself in the outer. And what is the inner in this case? Well, we might say that there's actually more than one inner, as we find out in this passage. We saw that too in the previous section, 2 sections ago, right? There was the inner of the outer of the inner. We can go on and on. So he goes on and he says, the actuality, general and particular, which observation previously found, is the actuality of the inherited body. From the psychological point of view, actuality in and for itself and the specific individuality were supposed to be brought into relation to one another. What does that mean? So when we were engaging in psychology in the previous section, trying to deduce these laws, we wanted to find some way to connect the actuality, the way things are, the Wirklichkeit, right? The really. With the individual without compromising the individuality of the individual. Not just their uniqueness, but their capacity for self-determination, for self-formation, for taking a stance upon themselves, even if it only in an implicit way. Those are difficult things to reconcile, aren't they? It's not quite so straightforward, but that's what indeed Hegel has been aiming at throughout this whole section of reason. So he goes on and he says, here, the whole specific individuality is the object of observation. Now, observing reason is going to focus on the individual as individual. The individual has wiggled out of the psychological laws that were supposed to determine them. Fine, we'll look at the individual, him or herself. How's that going to work? He says, on each side of the antithesis is itself the whole. The outer is the whole of the individual. The inner is also the whole of the individual. Now, mathematically, that seems to be a bit of a problem, right? Because we've got, half? Each half is one. But we're not doing mathematics here. We're doing conceptual dialectics or phenomenology. We're trying to make sense out of how it is that the individual is seated in the body, which we're not going to fully get at this point, but that's going to be worked with over the course of this section, and that there's an inner and an outer manifestation or aspect, or however you want to put it. Really, there's going to be more than one inner here, too, by the way, that we should point out. So he says, to the outer whole, therefore belongs not only the original being, that is the inherited body, but equally the formation of the body. So this here is, which appears to be more inner, is actually also part of the outer, right? the formation of the body by the activity of the inner being. So what are we talking about there? You notice I've got some other arrows drawn, and there's reasons for that here in this. So the outer is taken by the inner. And what do we mean by the inner here? Well, the individual, as he says, posited as consciousness and movement. The activity, the tun of the last paragraph, the doing, right? So the outer body is something that is available, you might say, for the consciousness, for the aspect of movement that the consciousness is able to get. This is really talking about the relationship between the soul and the body, but in a very different way, as Jean Hippolyte recognized in this section. Now, what happens with that is the individual forms their body by their activity, by the activity of the inner being. How is the inner still inner if it's externalizing itself in the outer? This is a problem that we're going to see dealt with, but it's also one that we've already seen played with in the previous paragraphs, the previous sections, right? So he goes on and he says, so to this outer whole, we've got these two parts, or two aspects. The activity of the inner being forms it, and the body is a unity of the unshaped and of the shaped being. And is the individual's actuality, it's a beautiful phrase, the individual's actuality, their Wirklichkeit, permeated by his being for self. If we want to think about this in terms of the relationship between the body and the soul, or the body and the personality, or the body and the mind, where exactly in your body is your mind located? Oh, you might say, oh, it's up there in the brain pan. Really? Is that where you're conscious? Let me poke you in the, not just in the eye, but let me punch you in the stomach and see whether you're conscious down there at all. We don't have to get quite so extreme with it, but you get what we're saying. Consciousness is something that permeates the living body. This is something, by the way, that Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a 20th century phenomenologist, who drew, I would say, almost equally upon Hegel as he did Husserl, really was quite attentive to. And that's going to be something that's coming out of the reflections in this section. So he says this inner being, or this whole which contains within itself the specific original fixed parts and the lineaments arising solely from the activity, is, and this being is the expression of the inner being, of the individual posited as consciousness and movement. That's what the inner being is. This inner being is, too, no longer a formal, spontaneous activity. This is very important, devoid of content or indeterminate. There is determinacy there. This is what allows us to have some sort of connection that's not quite yet well established between what else is inner, which is what Hegel's going to call the original character of the person. But here's what's going on. Expression is taking place from the inner, expressing itself in the outer, and all of these aspects are involved within the living human body of the individual. So he goes on and he says, the inner being is, on the contrary, an intrinsically determined original character whose form is merely the activity. So now we're posed with a problem, and that's what he ends this paragraph with. We have then to consider here how to determine the relation between these two sides and what is to be understood by this expression of the inner in the outer. It's not yet clear. It's one of those catchphrases, right? The outer expresses the inner. Okay, what does that actually mean? That's where we're going in the paragraphs yet to come.